The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. We all need to eat. The better the food, the better our lives. BC is a great place to grow and produce food, says James Donaldson, the CEO of BC Food and Beverage. But the sector is facing challenges. Those challenges include financial, land, government rules and regulations, and as always, weather. The food and beverage industry is a substantial contributor to the BC economy. According to the State of the Industry report recently published by BC Food and Beverage, it accounts for $14.2 billion in revenue, employs 39,000 people in 3,400 businesses, and contributes $3.7 billion to the provincial GDP. Impressive numbers, says Donaldson, and the but is the industry is stressed. In the past 5 years, costs have soared, land, labor, and raw material prices are all up, and at the same time, producers have been unable to raise prices in keeping with those cost increases. I invited James Donaldson, the CEO of BC Food and Beverage, to join me for a conversation that matters about the challenges the industry faces in BC and pass to solutions that will ensure we have access to the food we need at prices that we can afford. James, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Stuart.
When we take a look at the state of the industry in BC, those numbers do look impressive, $14.2 billion. The food sector is a major contributor. Just how important is it from an economic perspective? And then let's talk about our ability to meet BC's food needs.
Yeah, I mean, great question. And there's kind of definitely two parts to that. From an economic perspective, I mean, the food industry is almost as big as forestry. So, and if you really combine agriculture and food production, you know, you're talking about 18 or 19 billion, especially when you factor in seafood. So it's right up there with the largest sectors that we have here. You know, it's one of the biggest employers that we have as well. So it's a huge economic driver, and you know, it helps build in resilience. The one thing about the food industry is at a macro level, it's pretty stable. Like, you know, people need to eat every day. So there's that continuity that it provides. But then, you know, to the other part of your question, you know, there's this social benefit as well. You know, I think sometimes we take for granted where our food comes from. And what we learned during COVID when we started to experience empty store shelves is, you know, we hadn't really experienced that since the Great Depression. And I think more and more people started to really think about where their food came from. And you know, the more you think about it, the more you realize how much, not just the BC food economy, but the whole federal one. It's really based on, you know, we ship a lot of our agricultural products offshore as commodities, and we buy them back. And we're very vulnerable and we're very dependent on imports. So if there's any kind of a supply chain disruption, which we had during the atmospheric river crisis in 2021, where the highways were closed, or the port strike, or, you know, potential rail disruptions, every time that happens, we're scrambling because we're so reliant on imports. And I think, you know, I think it was what we really need to be thinking about moving forward to protect the food system. It's not just the economic impact, but it's also the social impact and our ability to have food sovereignty and the ability to feed our own population.
Well, that's interesting that you bring up food sovereignty, because when in doing some of my research, I see that we really only produce about 35% of our own food requirements in British Columbia. We do not have food sovereignty.
No, and we export, you know, we export almost $4 billion, but we import twice that much. And that's really where the key is. And certain sectors, you know, if you look at the seafood sector, most of it, I think 80 or 90% of it is exported. So if you've noticed when you go to the grocery store, the shrimp is from Argentina, you know, things like that. It's challenging and it's frustrating, but so the problems aren't simple to kind of fix that, because they're fairly systemic, and they're kind of go right back to the origins of Canada and how we sort of built our commodities-based economy. So I think it's going to take some will to change, but I think there's more motivation behind it because we're vulnerable right now.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So what do we need to do to be able to increase the amount of food that we can produce here at prices that make doing so economically makes sense?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a few parts of that. It's a big question, and obviously, if any of them were easy fixes, we would have figured them out and done them by now. You know, when you look at food production, the costs are very high, and that's tied to a number of things, but it's cost to the high price of land, And sometimes that's only half the problem. Even finding the availability of industrial space is a hard challenge to overcome, and there's not any new land inventory coming online, so it just starts to kind of compress. You look at Amazon, who has 4 million square feet of industrial land, occupies 4 million square feet of industrial land inventory just in the Lower Mainland and the Fraser Valley. That number was 3 million only 2 years ago. So but there hasn't been an introduction of more land. So it's just been this giant sponge that sucked that up. Labor costs are very high. Unfortunately, when you look at the food sector, it's never been historically a very high margin industry to start with. So when you started to have some of the rising costs that they've been dealing with, it makes it problematic. They're also in BC, the part that's unique to BC though is most of the companies are relatively small. Like even if you look at the largest processors in BC, in Ontario, they'd be medium size at best. And it's really dominated by a large number of small, entrepreneurial, innovative family businesses. That's just sort of the nature of the industry here. The problem is those smaller businesses don't have the same leverage as bigger ones. So they don't have the buying power, they don't have the efficiencies, they don't have the economies of scale. So you've got relatively low productivity. And then those small businesses, we shared an infographics part of our report. Those businesses that are doing under $5 million are more often than not losing money. So if you don't have money to reinvest back in your business, you have rising costs, you're essentially vulnerable to every increase in packaging, transportation, ingredients, labor. So with that low productivity and the low margin, it makes it you're falling behind, because we don't sell food in a vacuum, right? It's as we talked about just a few minutes ago, it's a global marketplace, and you have to be competitive against everyone, not just Alberta or not just the U.S. You have to look at the product that's flowing from everywhere. So those things all need to be kind of. The problem is any one of those is difficult to deal with, but just dealing with one is not necessarily going to solve the problems around food affordability and food sovereignty. And we need a real strategic approach to try and tackle all of them, or we're going to lose more ground, and that's what we're losing already. So it's getting concerning.
Well, you talk about the majority of these processors being fairly small businesses, and they cannot compete on their ability to pay rents against somebody like Amazon.
That's right.
And add in the fact that there is a pinch on industrial land, especially like in the Lower Mainland, Fraser Valley. But we've got a tremendous amount of underutilized agricultural land reserve lands. But I understand that there's a bizarre ruling here that says even though you're processing food, you can't process it on ALR land. And yet you can take that same ALR land and convert it into a home. How do we make sense of that?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm definitely not an expert in the agricultural land reserve and its use. But yes, I mean, when it was originally designed, it was designed for both food production and for farming. But over time, they've implemented different rules that made it a little bit more cumbersome. They were all done with good intentions, I think, over time, just to try and make sure that we're protecting, good quality agricultural land is definitely, a premium, in premium supply, and you don't want to mess with it. So, I totally understand that. But there is, over time though, there is land within the ALR that really isn't suitable for growing anything. But yes, because of some of those rulings, it's really hard to know what you can grow there. So there's a 50% rule. So ultimately you have to ensure that at least 50% of the inputs that are going to be done there are sort of coming from direct farm use. That can be very challenging for lots of reasons. I mean, even in BC, if it's, cherries or blueberries, the growing season is quite small. So how do you commit to a certain percentage of production when you only have access to local raw materials for a short period of time throughout the year? So there's some impracticality there. We made a recommendation that was specific to that though, because we also don't really know how much land is in the ALR that can't be used for agriculture. So what we sort of recommended to government is if we could have a proper land inventory where we understood, is there land that where we can't grow anything? Is it close to highway, highway access, rail access, the key infrastructure components? Does it have any infrastructure in place? Because there's specific requirements for food processing, like water access, electrical, all of those things. Are all those in place? The problem is nobody can really answer that right now because, it could be 600 acres, it could be 40 acres, it could be 20, so it's sort of, our point is, well, do we even know if there's enough there that's worth talking about? If it's up in, say, Stewart, BC, there might be some opportunities around warehousing and distribution, but it's not going to be really a hub for food manufacturing.
Right, because it doesn't make sense to send it there.
Right.
Because as I understand, a considerable amount of processing right now happens just across the line in Washington State. We'll grow here, send to a processor there, and then re-import it back into British Columbia, our own product, because we can't supply the industry with affordable facilities or land to be able to do that. So that's one part of the equation. Of course, because the Lower Mainland and Fraser Valley is now becoming such an expensive place to live and operate a business, you need to pay people a certain rate to keep them on as dedicated team members. So labor costs are driving up the ability to produce food. I don't know that there's an answer to how you deal with that.
Yeah, that one is a hard one to address, simply because you're right. Like with the cost of living, I think every one of the members we've talked to, I mean, they want to make sure they're doing right by their employers. They're making sure that they're that they have a good income, a good competitive wage, and most will pay above the minimum wage. I know the minimum wage has increased significantly, but I haven't heard a lot of pushback on that, just because most of them are already paying above that rate already. The challenge, though, is that the productivity from our industry in BC is quite low. It's actually a national problem. We have quite a low productivity challenge. So it's not specifically unique to BC, but when you're having higher labor costs than the rest of the country, and then you're still dealing with that low productivity, the only way to really combat that is to sort of make investments in advanced manufacturing and technology so you can be more efficient. Especially if you can't find a bigger space or you can't find a place to build production, you have to be able to be more efficient in a smaller footprint. That's just the reality for the overwhelming majority of BC companies. But when you've got a low margin industry where margins have actually been shrinking over the last few years, even though the top line growth has been going, the businesses don't have enough money to reinvest back into their business. The traditional lending is not very practical, because their ability to pay those loans back are going to be based on future revenues from their planned expansion. And unfortunately, that's not really a very desirable business model for, if dollars tomorrow to pay for money today is not a great a mechanism. So they end up sort of feeling the pinch, and that is where government, they can play a role. Yes. A lot of innovation. There's been a lot of different types of innovation funding. The problem, though, is very few processors that I know of actually need something that's new to the world. They don't need a technology that's new to the world, which is generally what you need to get funding under some grant funding under the types of programs that exist, mostly federal. But yeah, so most processors will need an adaptation of something existing to be able to customize for their for their unique products that they're making, and that's unfortunately that never seems to meet their criteria. So if you can't borrow the money and you don't have the profit to reinvest back in your business, and you can't get the grant funding support, you kind of get stuck, and this is where businesses level off, and you have to wonder, well, how long are you going to level off before you wonder, is this worth doing anymore, which is what we want to avoid, or feeling the only way they can be successful is by moving to Alberta or to the US or to another jurisdiction where they feel they have a chance of being more competitive. And that's really what we'd like to avoid, because as soon as capacity starts to shrink, then there's a trickle-down effect, because it really starts to impact agriculture, because processors in BC are agriculture's largest customer. So if that shrinks, then it puts more pressure on agriculture margins as well.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Government does have another instrument that it could use, and that would be tax write-offs at a much higher rate that allow that small business to amortize that investment over time. But that's a choice that they have to make. Right. But as you say, the threat right now, and it's happening, is that producers here are being lured away to Alberta, because Alberta is saying, come, we'll help you, and our costs are significantly lower. How big of a threat is that?
Well, it's funny. I'd been hearing, we've been hearing about it for a while, but in the last few months, especially as we started doing this report, starting to talk to companies, after talking directly with the Alberta government and some of the economic development people, it became very clear that they've got a very strong strategy in place, and they're executing on the strategy. The challenge is we don't have a strategy. I don't know if, and because of the economic realities of living in BC, I don't think that an attraction strategy will probably be very practical for us, but certainly we need a retention strategy. We can't afford to lose the ones that we have already. If you think about the film industry, it was quite booming and quite successful for years, and we touch on this on our report. the industry kind of eroded and moved away to areas where they felt they could be more competitive, and the BC government saw the vision in putting an attraction package, and they came back, and now it's a successful industry. Still a lot smaller than the food industry, but it's back, and it's a $4.5 billion industry in BC. So it's an important part of the economy. The problem is food companies aren't as mobile and modular as the movie industry. So it's pretty easy to be able to move them back and have them relocate. If you have a big, if you have a $75,000 plant that shuts down and builds in Airdrie, Alberta, I mean, they're not coming back because of tax incentives. So we need to really prioritize keeping the ones that are here, keeping them here and keeping them competitive.
Well, then that comes back to government does play an important role in being able to try and develop those kinds of strategies.
Right.
Are you finding a willingness on behalf of the provincial government to say, okay, let's do this? And I ask it because back when we had a panel a few weeks ago about food, Peter Dillon was on that panel, and he, along with Lenore Newman, had put together what was a very important and strategic document for then Premier John Horgan. And he goes...
the Food Security Task Force.
The Food Security Task Force. Yeah. And he said, but it still sits there. He goes to Quebec, and Quebec goes, this is a great report. Thank you very much. We're implementing it, and it's working. So is there an appetite to start to embrace some of those strategies that can hopefully help to support BC producers?
Well, I think so. I'm optimistic. We've had a lot of really good conversations with multiple ministries, and they've all been very receptive. I mean, first off, I'll say, the problems are really complex. And sometimes, I think with government, it's very easy to look at, well, let's deal with agriculture and deal with some of the things that are challenging them. But they've also had so many different climate events that have affected them over the last few years. It's been more about, don't use the term loosely, but putting out fires literally and figuratively. They've had droughts, they've had floods, they've had a lot of different short-term crises that they've had to deal with. So none of the focus has really been on growth and prosperity of that sector. Then you look at processing, and it's this large industry, and sometimes I would suggest that there's probably better understanding of agriculture than food processing, and then there's seafood, of course, as well. So the problem is, I think we kind of everyone kind of doesn't really take that holistic approach and looking at the whole food system, and it seems to be an understanding that maybe that's been a missing ingredient, and that's really where we're trying to focus our efforts is that it's not about agriculture, it's not about processing, it's not about seafood, it's about understanding the food system, and then there's those three drivers. There's the affordability part. There's the threat of outside jurisdictions that are actually trying to attract business here, whether it's Alberta or Ontario or the US. And then there's that going back to the food sovereignty piece. It's not just about those jobs leaving. It's not just about the GDP leaving. It's okay, well, now we're going to be more vulnerable and more dependent on imports, which is what we're trying to reverse. And that'll actually have the opposite effect of what we're trying to accomplish.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So, you're painting a bit of a bleak picture here at the moment, even though the industry keeps moving forward.
Yeah.
But one of the other things in my introduction is I talked about producers aren't able to raise prices in harmony with their increased costs. And yet the consumer goes, what are you talking about? It's costing me a lot more when I go to the grocery store. What is holding up the ability for producers to be, or standing in the way of producers being able to increase their prices?
Yeah, it's another complex one, and it's not just specific to retail, it's also food service. But, in Canada, you've got, thousands and thousands of small suppliers selling to a very small number of large customers. So this, so the playing field is not very level. It hasn't been for some time, but there's been more and more consolidation on the retail side, in particular, but even on food service. You've got Cisco and GFS, right? I mean, they represent a huge chunk of the food service sector. So I don't think there's a lot of difference there. But I mean, retail, they've definitely gotten a lot of bad press in the last couple of years, or in the last couple of years in particular. But they're also not a high margin industry. They're very
low margin.
Yeah, it's low margin, and their profits are increasing, but it's still a sort of a set percentage as prices go up. So they do. I mean, they pass on costs. The challenge for processors is there's There's been an increase in fees and program spend. So you don't, it's not just the product, it's not just the price of your product that you're selling. You also, if you want it to be supported, if you want to support merchandising programs, if you want to be in their flyer, if you want to have an end cap, those are other things that cost money. Or if the retailer decides that they want to invest in other strategic initiatives, they'll go to their vendors and just sort of, without really warning them, they'll start to remove percentages off the invoices that they're paying them. So you all of a sudden receive and you're getting less than you thought you were going to get. So there's some blurred lines there as well. But we also recognize that retailers have increasing costs. But there's a lag, especially since COVID. The prices were escalating of everything so quickly. And it takes a lot of time and effort to even be able to pass costs on, like to build it into your pricing. So there's always a lag. So by the time, it might take you 6 months to get a price increase, but in that 6 months, your prices have probably gone up another 15. So you're always falling behind. So that's really reflected if you look at our report and you kind of see where the margins were declining for 2 or 3 years. It was during that really inflationary time, and it was because of this long lag that would happen between being able to pass those prices on and dealing with the rising costs at the same time.
So what's the most important 2 or 3 steps moving forward that we can help to start to address these challenges? Because as you say, they're complex and in many cases systemic.
Yeah. So one, I think the most important thing we need to do is decide if the food industry is a priority in this province or not. And it really
that is an important consideration, isn't it?
Yeah, because ultimately you could decide we want to be a resource-based economy and priority is going to go to LNG and forestry and those things, and that's fine. But but British Columbians really need to make sure that they understand what the implications are. There's a downside to that. So one, I think that needs to be made. I think in terms of low-hanging fruit, there's a lot of different funding programs that the ministry already offers, but it seems like the priorities of them change all the time. Like there's a manufacturing jobs grant, and the priority for that is forestry. There's jobs and skills trainings programs that are available, but the priority is for remote communities, which is very seldomly processing. So those types of things, if you're going to make a food a priority, then you can also make them higher priority sectors in some of the funding programs that already exist. I think that's a good place to start. I do think taking a look at that, and then it's a matter of developing the strategy. You mentioned it earlier, the Food Security Task Force, they came up with a number of recommendations that haven't been brought forward. So I don't think developing a strategy is going to need to be something that takes years. I mean, we don't have time for that anyway.
And we've got it.
We've got a lot of it, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of pulling a lot of that past work forward, looking at the gaps and focusing on those and developing a competitiveness strategy is really what's needed. And that looks at the investment piece, that looks at the innovation component. How do we get productivity up? How do we free up more land? How do we make land more accessible? The other part we haven't really talked about, we touched on Amazon and industrial space. We also have a situation in BC where industrial landowners aren't prioritizing food. So if you have a building that's already set up for food production, which can be a significant cost, but with water and sanitation and drainage and all of the things that a food company needs, there's buildings that are like that that they would prefer to lease to Amazon or to a warehouse or anything else. If you look at the Campbell Heights industrial development, it was probably the last major industrial development here because we don't have any more space to do it. It was pretty much built for warehousing and distribution. There was no water access, so some of the food companies that have had to move into that area, they've had to spend millions of their own money just to bring in water and sanitation, just to make sure that they have access to the right infrastructure. So I think that approach will really go a long way, and we don't have to start from scratch because a lot of that good work's already been done.
Well, I think as Peter Dillon pointed out, we have to keep having these conversations frequently, and more people need to be sharing that so that they rise up as far as priority for average British Columbians. Thanks for coming in and giving us a glimpse. And of course, your report is available online.
It is, yeah. And I encourage anybody who's interested to look at it. So
thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stuart. Appreciate it.